Good evening and welcome to the fourth session of Masters of Philosophy. We started the last time with a question, what is Indian about Indian philosophy? And I told you there is another question there, what is philosophy? This has an answer in different ways in both the traditions. In Western philosophy, philosophy is philosophia, love for wisdom. In Indian philosophy, wisdom is not as important as perspective, as making sense of, as making meaning out of. So our philosophy is called sometimes darshana, or in other ways, it is also sometimes referred to as a way of living in the Tamil Dravidian traditions. Other people sometimes call philosophy as a way to escape the suffering of the world. So there's no one word for philosophy. We, again, in order for us to have a fork and knife, decide that darshana is a good way to classify philosophy because people have compendiums which they call Sarva Darshana Sangraha or Shad Darshana Sangraha, and therefore we decide that because these compendiums consist of darshanas or ways of seeing or perspectives or opinions, darshana is a good word for philosophy. But darshana is not love of wisdom. So if you are studying darshana, the bhakti movements, the philosophy of the emotion of love for a god would be included in philosophy. But till today, I have to actually find a book that includes the bhakti tradition directly into philosophy. It's not included in the Shad Darshanas unless it is Sanskritized and it is called Vedanta or Dvaita or Vishishtadvaita. Mirabai, for example, would not be in a textbook of philosophy. Yes, there would be speculations on the philosophy of poetry in Mirabai. That's an unusual paper and it will get published. But in the actual curriculum, you will never have Mirabai being taught. So, in common, we would still call them philosophers because they were thinkers, they had different perspectives. So for us, philosophy is something, and for them, philosophy is another thing. It comes back to the example of food, because food for us is a lot of other things, and for the Western philosophy, given their background, food is something else. It's just a conceptual mismatch. So what do? Well, we create a food court where all kinds of food can be food. Or we change the word. For example, sometimes in order to avoid confrontation with this whole idea of philosophy, I call it traditions of thought. Because that to me seems a good translation as any. Is there a Mirabai tradition of thought? Yes, there is. Is there a Basavanna tradition of thought? Yes, there is. Is there a Dalit tradition of thought? Yes, there is. So it's easy for me to understand philosophy as a tradition of thought and teach that in my classes. Now, the second thing that happens in Indian philosophy in the encounter between East and West is interesting because it creates certain kinds of paradigms. We have J. Garfield and Nalini Bhushan editing 2 books in Indian philosophy in English and during the colonial time. In these 2 books, they speak of a paradigm of Pandits, where Sanskrit Pandits or Pali Pandits or Prakrit Pandits, basically very traditional teachers and students of philosophy, study the texts, study the commentaries, and make a deep learning of these texts and the hermeneutics related to the text. They are often experts in Sanskrit or one of the classical languages, Pali or Prakrit, and they study the text in the original and make sense of it. On the other hand, there's a professor paradigm. These people know Sanskrit sometimes, but they are all educated in Western philosophy also. And they try to make sense of their own traditional thought and again see if it is amenable to rational thought of Western philosophy. So you would look for epistemology in, say, the Nyaya Sutra, or you would look for ethics in the Arthashastra, or you would look for phenomenology in the texts of Ayurveda. So you would basically take an instrument and say, or match the following card and say, match epistemology to pramana in Indian philosophy, match metaphysics to padartha in Indian philosophy. And a lot of this philosophy which is now done is basically done through these paradigms. Of course, the other one is always prevalent because during the nationalist discourse, all of Indian philosophies was a monolithic Indian philosophy. So the kind of hegemony of Vedanta is well known. People decided that that is the most rational thought, and therefore it's very good to be a representative of Indian philosophy. But as I said, like there's no language called Indian, there is no philosophy, one philosophy called Indian. So it's in these times and eras, it's good for us to take a critical look and see what we consider philosophy need not belong to one hegemonic tradition. And we give everyone else a seat at the philosophy table, at least at the Indian philosophy table. The other thing that I want to talk about is that though there are pundits and there are professors, there's a third category that people do not seem to pay attention to, and this is the pravachan people or the preachers of Indian philosophy. Now, it's very strange that my first exposure to philosophy was not through a textbook of Nyaya Sutra, nor through Shankara's Advaita text, but through the lectures of a missionary, well-read Swamiji sitting on a lectern and talking to me about the meaning of Bhagavad Gita. He was basically doing Vedanta philosophy, Advaita philosophy, but my lectures, he was not traditional because he was teaching in English. He knew Sanskrit, but he was not like a Sanskrit Pandit. There was a very lot of difference between the Pandit paradigm or the traditional teacher guru paradigm and this modern neo-guru, a Swamiji, who taught me the philosophy. Now, it is true that some of the philosophy that was taught to me was not the academic kind of philosophy, but it was philosophy. And that's the kind of philosophy most people in India listen to. They listen to the preachers. So we not only have the paradigm of the professors and the pundits, we also have the paradigm of the preachers. I found this interesting because only Raghuram Raju in his book Debates on Indian Philosophy speaks about the Mahatma paradigm and the Swamiji paradigm in one of his chapters. So the Swami paradigm is a larger category which includes people who taught philosophy, particularly Vedanta philosophy or Buddhist philosophy, to large sections of the audience. Goenka's contribution to Vipassana and the teaching of Buddhism to a large-scale public during his Vipassana courses is amazing. Everyone would go for this 15-day retreat, and it was very popular. I think it is still popular. And we would do the first 15-day basic program, and then the 3-month program would teach us all about Buddhism and the Tripitaka. Again, so even yoga is taught like that. All of my Yoga Sutra training is from a yoga teacher who was a Swami. My textbooks on yoga are from that. I hadn't even heard of Matilal when I was young, except in academic circles. So what does that tell you about philosophy? It tells you something about Western philosophy. When we try and sit at the table with our forks and knives and try to make our Indian food fit that fork and knife, what happens is a lot of foods gets excluded, and these kinds of foods which people eat every day are not included. There's a certain gatekeeping quality to Western philosophy which we have subconsciously imbibed. Every time a Dalit raises a question, is there a Dalit philosophy? The gatekeeper inside, the philosopher inside me, who has been trained in this tradition, starts to say, but then there is no abstract thought in Dalit conversations. It's all experience. And therefore what happens is, the problem is not that the Dalit is not doing theoretical ideas. The problem is that his theoretical ideas, the way he sees the world, the way she sees the world, the way a woman sees the world, has no place inside the canons of philosophy. Philosophy itself has become a gated community. And therefore, it is important for us that if we want to have a conversation about philosophy, we open this gate and allow all kinds of thinking and traditions to come in and try their hand at critically making sense of the world. Let's have true darshana, which is darshana is to see beyond what is there. And so if a tribal can see beyond what is there in front of him and make sense of his world through some kind of rationality, it is important for us to include that rationality. If we continue to follow gatekeeping, we are bringing different kinds of knives and forks to the table. Maybe we are bringing caste and color and language and hegemony and hierarchy, all different kinds of tests and measures which are meant to exclude and not include. And each time we exclude, use one of these knives and forks and instruments to exclude a way of thinking from our table, we are poorer for it. And that is perhaps why Indian philosophy is still lying like an archaeological museum exhibit, because we haven't welcomed diversity of thought. So the robustness of Indian philosophy, whatever that is about thinking of new ways of including other thoughts, other traditions of thoughts, other kinds of making sense of the world into its fold. Before the next week, I would like to think that all of you will give thought to how can you include other ways of thinking. Are there other ways of thinking? For example, is there a philosophy that can be written as poetry? Or is there a philosophy that can be sung with emotion? Is there a philosophy that can enter the kitchens into the making of butter? These are all ideas, but they need to be explored more in detail, and we shall do them slowly over time. So here's your Mistress of Philosophy signing off with delight, and keep waiting for the next 2 videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of the next video upload, and do put in comments. I will respond to these comments and we can have a rich discussion right there below in the comment boxes. Spread the word. Let's have a discussion. Let's make Indian philosophy vibrant. Bye today and have a good night.